Good morning, and welcome to the 7th IECO-RCC Colloquium. My name is Danilo Petranovic, and I direct the Abigail Adams Institute, a small, not-for-profit scholarly institute here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Our mission is to build intellectual communities, habits of mind and character here in the Cambridge community. We offer a lot of programming in the areas of American political thought, political economy, and other subjects. And we have been partnering with IECO and RCC for the last, I think, 5 years to run this colloquium. It is a real pleasure to be back here today. So the main sponsor of the colloquium is the Institute for Ethics in Communication and Organizations, that's IECO, at the University of Valencia in Spain. IECO aims to expand knowledge and promote critical thinking about the role of ethics in management, leadership, and communication in organizations. The Institute promotes dialogue between the social sciences and philosophy based on a holistic view of the person. And the director of IECO is Professor Manuel Guillén, and I will soon invite him to say a few words before we begin today. Finally, before I have you come up, Manuel, I also want to express our appreciation to Rodrigo Certeno, the executive director of the Real Colegio Complutense. This is the place where we're meeting. Thank you again for hosting us now for the 7th year here, Rodrigo. And I would also like to acknowledge Mr. Alvaro Gonzalez, the General Consul of Spain here in Boston. Thank you again for joining us. So the title of the 7th colloquium is Ethics and Trust Matter in Business, a tribute to the legacy of Michael Hoffman. And before we start, Professor Guillén wants to say a few words. Thank you. Come on.
Thank you, Danilo. Just a few words to say thank you to Danilo for being here, to every one of the panelists, incredible panelists and great friends. Thank you for being here. Then I wanted to give a special thanks also to the Consul of Spain, because he's coming for now every year to this activity. And I will ask him to say a few words after me, because it's a special occasion today. And then thank you very especially to Rita. She was the one who really made this happen. So I wanted to say that. And to Rodrigo, because without the RCC, this wouldn't be happening. And he's helping a lot these last weeks. And especially, I want to say thank you to Bliss, the wife of Michael Hoffman, who is with us today. Thank you. And the entire team of the center, Hoffman Center, Mary and Bob, you're here. And also some of the fellows are here today. Thank you, all of you, for coming, and everyone for coming today. We wouldn't have a colloquium without you, with your insights and questions and comments. Also, thank you to Jim and the team who is recording this event today. They have been doing this for 7 years, and it's been great, so thank you. And I really wanted to say thank you. I wanted to give thanks to God for the gift of Michael Hoffman. He was an incredible academic, as you know, and we will hear today. He was an amazing person, so generous. He was a great husband and father. And he was, among a lot of things, a great friend of all of us here. So I want just to ask you, all of you, to give a good, great applause to Mike today. And I'm giving the floor for a second to the Consul of Spain. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think I need this, no? Don't you hear me?
Recording.
Oh, okay. Right. Well, I speak in English because not everybody understands Spanish. And first of all, of course, I would like to express my gratitude to Manuel for keeping me invited year after year. I see that this year is special because of the passing away of Michael Hoffman from Bentley University, who gave a real important impulse to ethics in business, and who was behind the initiatives like the founding of the Center for Business Ethics in Bentley University, and for the support of IECO in Valencia. Right, I must say I am impressed by your subject. I'd like to say something, just a very simple thought. Before coming here as Consul General, I was ambassador to the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe is one of these international organizations that owes its prestige to caring for values, very concentrated among values and principles that have to be supported. However, my other colleagues, from time to time we had meetings and ambassadors exchanged the views. They insisted, and that was something agreed, that it was not the time for principles, that one of my colleagues usually repeated, values are not valued. And perhaps I think this is a time that we are living with this orientation at the moment. I'd like to remind of a very famous episode in the Marx Brothers film when Groucho Marx tells somebody, "Those are my principles, and if you don't like them, well, I have others." I think your international colloquium is perhaps today a sign of hope also that values and principles can counterbalance other purely instinctive or emotional feelings. Muchas gracias a todos.
Gracias.
Great. Well, thank you very much for those remarks. Two other people I would like to recognize are Mary Chiasson, from the Associate Director at Bentley University, as well as Robert McNulty, Director of Programs at Bentley. Thank you for joining us today as well. Yes. Okay, well, on to our panelists. Reminder, everyone will speak around 10 minutes, and then after we finish, we'll take a break. Our guiding question today is this. The beginning of the 21st century has seen remarkable displays of self-seeking and corruption, especially in the upper echelons of our institutions. Unfortunately, business hasn't been immune to these disturbing trends. How does one begin to reform hearts, minds, and the structures underlying modern firms and organizations? What could we do differently in order to facilitate the dignity and flourishing of all? Where are good examples to be found, and how can they inspire the next generation to embrace true ethical leadership? I now turn to our first panelist, and that's Dawn Marie Driscoll, the Emeritus Executive Director and Advisory Board Member of the Center for Business Ethics at Bentley. Ms. Driscoll serves as an independent director of DWS Mutual Funds and was elected member of the Board of Governors of the Investment Company Institute, ICI, the National Association of Mutual Funds, serving on the ICI's audit, nominating, and executive committees. Ms. Driscoll also serves as chair of the ICI's Director Service Committee, which advised the Institute regarding issues for independent directors of mutual funds, and then as founding chair of the Independent Directors Council, the National Organization of Mutual Fund Directors. She was formerly a business law partner at Palmer and Dodge in Boston, and she also served for over a decade as vice president of corporate affairs and general counsel of Filene's, the Boston-based department store chair. So there's much more, but I'll end on that note. I loved Filene's. I had very fond memories shopping there. In any event, Dawn Marie, please take over. Yeah.
The late departed Filene's. I was asked to start with a couple personal reflections about Mike. He talked a lot about trust and integrity and leadership, and he exemplified all those traits. As followers, we trusted him. He was obviously a leader, a pioneer in a field when it was an oxymoron. And he had the highest integrity. Mike, for those of you who know him, know he could not be rushed. If he was serving on a panel, he would talk very slowly so that you make sure you get his points. He couldn't be rushed in filling out the brackets for March Madness either, in the pool we entered every year. I wrote books and articles with him, as all of you did, and whether it was discussing what point we were going to make about Boston University's board or Enron, he would be deliberative to a fault, I thought. Well, let's consider this. Should we say it this way? And we would talk for hours, as I know so many of you did. He liked all of us. He liked a good glass of wine. He liked music. He liked sports. And he loved bliss beyond belief. So we were all so lucky to know him. So I'm going to use some of the work that he and I did together to address the issue of upper echelons, how we reach the hearts and minds, particularly of board members and board structures. Because I believe that organizational scandals at their heart lie at the feet of the governing body. This is not to say that board members are unethical or evil. I think if you look at most scandals, you will find it's the collective action of rational, well-intentioned people who just missed it or didn't pay attention. Let me give you an example from my own career, unfortunately. When I was general counsel of Filene's, I was also in charge of many things, including security. And one day a guy called me and he said, you just arrested my wife for shoplifting. I said, okay. And he said, but she didn't do it. I said, okay. And I said, well, the court will decide. And he said, oh, she's gone to court and she was found guilty, but she didn't do it. So I said, okay, I'll look into it. Well, to make a long story short, I discovered massive fraud in that store. The security manager was asking his security operators to falsify cases. So we'd go pick up you, charge you with shoplifting. We'd even get employees, take them to court. They'd be found guilty. And, I patted myself on the head and thought, well, I was so smart to uncover that fraud. But then I realized the problem lay at my desk because, I'm embarrassed to say this, I had included in performance measures for security managers number of cases. And worse, we had honored this guy as security manager of the year because, among other things, he had a lot of cases. So I was an upper echelon executive, well-intentioned, but I didn't think it through. So let me reflect on the board level, and I'm going to use 5 of 15 barriers to ethical conduct that Mike and I used over the years. Mary knows them well, because we kept reusing them. And then I'm going to suggest 2 antidotes. So first barrier, NBD. It's no big deal, right? Mike's famous Pinto case. Car has to cost $2,000. To repair the exploding gas tanks would cost another $1. I'm not going to do it. Bridgestone tire. Yeah, the tires are separating in Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. No big deal. Whoops, they're separating in Arizona now. Dow Corning silicone breast implants. When that started, it represented 1% of the company's sales. Ended up going into bankruptcy. So is this an issue of the balance of power in which ethics and compliance officers or general counsels or PR executives come to the board and say, it's no big deal. We've got this covered. It takes courage for a board member to speak up and to challenge something and to be other than the parsley on the fish at a board luncheon, as one executive described board members. Second barrier, start with conclusions. Bottom line, we are going to make our numbers this quarter. How many of you own mutual funds or stock or check the stock market? You all want performance, right? Well, there's a lot of talk in settings like this about the purpose of business being more than just shareholder returns. And you may have some directors who actually believe that. But around the table, their job is to look at shareholder returns. And if they and the upper echelons are starting with the conclusions, we are going to make our numbers this quarter. That drives everything else. Similarly, in the nonprofit world, you're a nonprofit director. We are not going to spend more than X% of our budget on overhead. The rest is going to go for programs. Well, if any of you have read Dan Pallotta, you know that is outmoded thinking today. But I think a lot of directors still believe it. They start with that conclusion. Third barrier, mesmerizing culture. John talks a lot about culture issues. Most board members like their colleagues, and they like the intellectual activity, even if they don't like the work. And I know you've talked about work. The absolutely massive amounts of mind-numbing reading they have to do, and the thought of liability and litigation. Ira Milstein, who's an expert on corporate governance, has said we need more aggressive activist directors. But a lot of directors want to get along, with their colleagues. And the poster child for this, I think, if any of you have read it, is William Power's definitive report on the Enron board. The board failed in its oversight duties. It didn't demand information. It didn't understand financial transactions, and its controls were inadequate. But the board got along. They liked the increasing share price. They liked the positive publicity about Enron until it all blew up and it sank like a stone. Fourth barrier, fragmented information. Silos. Board members listen to presentations on various subjects. You make a presentation, then you do, then you do. But they don't connect the subjects, even though I think the responsibility of board members is really the forest, not the trees. They're listening to a lot of trees. Let's look at the Wells Fargo phony bank account scandal that you all know. Scandal that some people say was 2016. Well, the board knew about it in 2013 because there was an investigative article in the LA Times about phony bank accounts. The CEO of Volkswagen allegedly knew about the emissions fraud, but he didn't tell the U.S. bond investors who rely on bond offering documents for accurate and not misleading information. So what do these upper echelon executives do? They blame the branch bank managers, right? They blame the quality control emissions guys. But they don't put the whole picture together to see the harm to the institution. Last barrier, boiled frog, or groupthink. This is particularly true, I think, if there's an expert on the board, which is why I am totally opposed to having directors chosen by skill set. So the CPA has been on the board a long time, and he thinks everything's fine. So I'm not going to question these off-balance sheet, complex financial transactions, special purpose vehicles that I don't understand, because he says they're okay. The IT professional thinks that our cybersecurity defenses are fine, so I'm not going to push for an outside audit. After all, I'm the woman on the board, so I speak about HR and diversity issues. Everybody goes to get along. There's discussion, but it's not rigorous. After all, board meeting runs late, and we're late for the board dinner already. So how can we motivate directors to do the right thing and to avoid ethical minefields? Here I have two suggestions. First, I'd look at structure. When I give ethics talks, I sometimes use 4 words: It's process, not substance. Mike always said ethical issues are gray, but a good process will give you a good result. Today, I think I would add 3 more words. Process informs culture, especially board culture. In 1999, I was on a national task force of 3 CEOs and 3 independent directors to look at best practices for corporate governance. And we came up with 15 suggestions that were stronger than the Securities and Exchange Commission could have come out with by rulemaking. One of them was to call for executive sessions, which hopefully now is standard practice on all boards, profit or nonprofit. This is where directors, particularly if they have a high candor level and trust with each other, can sit without management and say, I didn't understand that presentation. And what's more, I'm not sure I like the presenter. Or, you know, we just got a little information, or we got no information about what a colleague of mine sent to me an article about this. And is anybody else worried about this? Or am I the only one that's worried about it? And you have a discussion. That's a better process. We all read about the Nissan CEO who was arrested in Japan, right? So last week, a special committee put the fault on the board and said the structure needed to change. It said the board meeting should last longer than 20 minutes. No longer should the CEO have the sole power to determine compensation. A majority of the board should be independent. The chairman should be an independent director. The nominating committee should have real power. Honestly, 20 years after I served on that national committee, I am shocked. Not shock like there's gambling going on in Casablanca, but I'm truly shocked that organizations don't have these kind of best practices today, and I think that's where ethical scandals come out. So last, I would look at motivation, and here I disagree with some of your past panelists, sorry, that said we shouldn't focus on negative stories as motivators for good ethical conduct. For years, I was the director of an insurance company, and we provided liability insurance for directors. And our slogan was, we wrap directors in bubble wrap, so they never have to worry about writing a personal check. But that's not what directors are motivated by. They don't want to see their name in the Wall Street Journal as being a director of an institution that exploded. Even in the nonprofit world, reputations can suffer. Mike and I wrote once about the United Way of America board. Big nonprofit, you know, head partner from a big national accounting firm on the board, head of American Express, Sears, CEOs. The executive director was indicted on 25 felony counts and convicted. And so these directors were on the witness stand in federal court being asked, so why didn't you pay attention when you got the anonymous letter about this guy? Well, because they liked him, right? I don't think they signed up for that nonprofit board wanting their reputation ruined. So when I talk to ethics and compliance officers and they go before the board, I say, listen, here's what I would do. I would bring in negative stories. And I would say, you probably read this story in the Wall Street Journal last week. Let me give you my opinion as to what went wrong and what the board could have done differently. And they pay attention. So today, I would use the story of Pacific Gas and Electric if I were making a presentation to a board. And I would say, you've probably read about Pacific Gas and Electric. Negligent in 2010 for natural gas explosion, faced criminal indictments. 17 of 21 fires in 2017 caused by its equipment. Regulators issued a 300-page damning report about its safety culture. Company faces $30 billion in losses. Due to last year's fire, 85 people killed, 18,000 structures gone. Stock price plummeted 88% in a year. Now it's bankrupt, CEO's out. But the board knew that its nearly 100-year-old transmission lines needed repair. They told the regulators in 2013 they'd repair them. They never did it. They never had any kind of record-keeping systems to find out where its bad lines were, lacked performance data, yet it gave out $4.5 billion in dividends to shareholders, and it spent millions on lobbying state officials. You probably saw 2 days ago, the federal judge says, that's overseeing it, said you cannot give out any more dividends. Yesterday, got a new CEO and 10 new board members. Everything that went on at Pacific Gas and Electric, I think, lies at the feet of the board that made financial decisions, capital resource decisions, ignored a bad safety culture. I would love to know what the culture of that former board was. Mike, I wish we were still writing today together. There's so much he would have wanted to think about and write about, not what happened, but why it happened, and why presumably ethical upper echelon people were caught unawares. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Don Marie. Next, we have James T. Hackett, Chairman and CEO of Alta Mesa Resources, a NASDAQ-listed energy company. Jim is also a senior advisor to Riverstone Holdings, LLC, a large private energy investment firm. Mr. Hackett is also director of, is it Fluor Corporations? Corporation, Enterprise Products, and NOV, all Fortune 500 companies.
Oh, so you're going to disagree with me?
He's a former chairman of the board of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. Mr. Hackett is a board member of the Baylor College of Medicine and former chairman, as well as Rice University, where he has served as a humanities and MBA faculty member for many years. He currently serves on the Plan 2 Liberal Arts Honors and McCombs School of Business faculties at the University of Texas, Austin. Jim holds a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Illinois, as well as an MBA and a Master's in Theological Studies 2016 from Harvard University.
Thank
Jim,
you, Janelle.
welcome.
I'm going to take a little different tact on the leadership side, if I may. And it's intriguing, this whole discussion about boards. One of the things we tend to want to do in boards, just as an aside, is to have consensus on decisions, partly because of this feeling of collegiality. One of the things we tried to do in a company I ran for some years ago was actually encourage directors to dissent from votes. In other words, to actually be recorded as saying no, which is exactly the culture you want inside of a management team, quite frankly. It just happens that it doesn't generally get pushed in board dynamics regularly. But I do want to say a few words about Michael, too. I suspect all of us will. I, for one, did not know him. I wish I had. I had no idea what he was doing and how special it was until I was invited to be part of this session. And when I started reading about what the center does and what he was taking charge of many years ago, there were two things that really, really struck me about what he was trying to accomplish. One is he didn't mistake ethics for morality. He actually thought that moral understanding was a very important part of how you derive ethics, ethical understandings. Two was that ethics in a vacuum doesn't matter. It actually has to be applied in practice, and particularly in the business field. And so I thought it was just wonderful, his background. It's so appropriate for what the issues are today as well as what we're speaking about. So I think because of my commitment to free enterprise as a very important pillar of democracy, I think of it as a sacred mission. I think it has tremendous temptations, but I also think it has great promise for human flourishing. And that's why what he chose to do with his brains and talent and people like you and you, it was a really cool thing to try to start making that difference even back then. We have the word reform in our charge here today. I just wanted to submit that maybe what the reform requires is us to go backwards or to reach backwards as opposed to necessarily reaching forward. And it's very much on this whole topic of morality versus ethics. And I think personally, even though popular opinion wouldn't necessarily say this, is that, and it may have something to do with negative stories, but those are not things you should ignore, they actually are lessons, is that we have this impression somehow that business is unethical. I think absolutely the opposite. I've served on at least 20 boards. of public companies. I have run 6 or 7 companies or large divisions of companies. I have not found in my history, and I have a very bad employment track record, so I've worked for a lot of companies. I have not found this vacuum of ethical intent that exists in business that we popularly believe. In fact, I think it's just the opposite. What I think most people in business in any large institution, and this applies to academic institutions, to medical institutions, to businesses itself, is they have an intent, much like Dawn Marie mentioned, to actually do well. And the question is, have they been trained with the right tools to actually make their job accomplishable? And that's where I think part of what is happening in today's society is working against that. There is less institutional backup. There is increasingly less nuclear family backup. There is increasingly much more complexity for leaders of institutions because the stakeholder population out there and the interests and the vocality of those stakeholder groups is much different than it used to be many, many years ago. So I think the chore of being an ethical leader has actually gotten much, much harder, much more complicated. And what we have increasingly armed people with in the training we do is ethical training that is something that is very secularly derived, intellectually understood, but not necessarily adopted in their heart and souls. And that's what I think is at the heart of what we maybe need to do in the future. One of the things I would love to see us do is engage participants in greater moral understandings, as I mentioned, and also the exercise of moral fortitude. It actually turns out that one of the most important things to be able to do to act ethically is to sometimes say no to popular views. It's actually to say no to your employees sometimes. It may be to say no to your directors sometimes. But if you don't actually have a deep understanding of moral philosophy, if you haven't developed your own personal moral code, you have a very difficult time actually framing the issue. It's just, so what I would suggest is that we actually stop trying to understand things from a behavioral ethics standpoint, where we assume that everybody cognitively has in their brain from growing up in this kind of a society, or any society that has a strong civil religion, which most that have had religious backgrounds, which is most countries in the world, is that you grow up with a civil religion and you assume that because you actually understand where ethics came from. The truth is we know where ethics came from. And Harvard's a perfect example. And I think Harvard may be part of the issue, quite frankly, as well, or at least is not serving the purpose it ought to serve in this regard. Ethics derived from metaphysics and moral philosophy. It didn't arrive on its own, wholly packaged. It came out of the study of theology primarily, but metaphysics absolutely, which then became moral philosophy, which then became secular ethics, incorporated into what is increasingly a civil religion in America. My postulate is if we leave it there, you will have things like Enron occur, even for people who grew up in very conservative, Christian-based households, in the case of nearly everybody on that executive team, all of whom I knew very, very well, Jeff Skilling of whom was in my business school class. So my thought is that we need a more classical engagement with participants that are leading institutions, business or otherwise. And I think that we ought to be spending more time talking about the purpose and moral precepts that attach to the practice of economics. Because there's an economic element of size in every single large institution. Any of you that serve in medicine or run medical institutions or on boards of medical institutions, you know how much of a business element there has to be in running that institution well and being a good, sustainable enterprise. The same is true in these fabulous universities like Harvard. There's a very big business element that, thank God, Drew and her successor now, Larry, are actually pretty equipped to do well with. They're not just academics, they're actually also economic practitioners of size. We need to go back and examine what was the purpose of economics in societies. And back even in 300 BCE in India, when Katia wrote the Arthashastra, or when Hebrews were talking about what the role of economics were in their society, it was absolutely essential to a flourishing society. But they also had principles that attached to the leadership of those economic institutions. And those principles are really well articulated in many cases and have an awesome amount of commonality. As you go across Buddhism, as you go across Islam, as you go across Christianity. And I think if people knew that, I know it would have mattered to me, even as a young Christian. All we got from the pulpit was, the eye of the needle. We were never told the story about the parables of the talents. We were never told that, in fact, Catholicism and Christianity for thousands of years had talked about how economics ought to be put underneath a societal umbrella, but that you should be proud of every profession done morally. And we should. And we need to start talking about that more. We need to actually start applauding other professions that do things morally and not criticize other professions that are doing things morally, just because we happen to not be in those professions and human envy may be at work. What we've got to realize, I think, is that humanist ethics developed in liberal progressive societies are ones that are relativized. I believe, and it's part of why I went to divinity school, that what happened at Enron was that they intellectually understood ethics. They put, way before it was de rigueur, 4 values out. And this only came out, in my view, in the post-audit in 2002. They were respect, integrity, communications, and excellence. If you looked at their 64-page code of conduct, you would see words like moral. You would see words like fairness and justice. They wanted to be that way. They wanted everybody else to be that way. They just weren't that way at the end of the day. Why weren't they that way? The question is, did they ever actually reflect on a moral philosophy? Did they ever develop a moral code personally, recognizing that oftentimes ethics is a situational code? You don't have to go back very far before the LGBT community was not even allowed a voice in this society. The question is, for you, is that a moral issue that you agree with, or is it simply societal ethics? And so I think we need to reach back. I think we need to start talking about things like emotional intelligence. I think we need to talk about things like moral psychology. How do people make moral judgments? How do people actually have their moral judgments changed? And I think we can do this in universities. I think we can do this in community colleges. I think we can do this in these billions of dollars being spent in businesses and institutions all over the world in training programs for leadership. But we have to get over what I consider almost a stigma in today's world, which is that somehow you recognize that ethics is not behavioral, just behavioral. You actually have to deeply examine moral codes and introduce that into our education. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So next we have Fidel Garcia Guzman, CEO of Guzman Global, a family-owned business based in Valencia, Spain, that distributes raw materials for different industries. The 3 business units are plastics and rubber, minerals, and coffee and nuts. They are a member of 200 people with subsidiaries in Portugal, Italy, and Turkey, and sales of 320 million euros in over 50 countries. Fidel has a degree in economics from the University of Valencia and an MBA at the IECE Business School in Barcelona. Previously, he has worked for Polimerilon Guzman company, and I'll also say that he's a member of the board of directors of the Zircon Industry Association and also a professor at the Masters in Business Strategy at the University of Valencia. Welcome, Fidel.
Thank you, Danilo. And thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to be here. I'm impressed and honored being surrounded by such a group of panelists. I didn't have the chance either to meet Michael, but I've also gone through his work and read some of his papers, and well, I would like to join Jim's words. Okay, so I think it's very nice that we're doing this tribute to him today. Well, I'm trying to answer to Danilo's question through our own experience and view about the topic, okay? So please frame it in the sense of 200 people company that I'm trying to answer to this question to, okay? Basically, I would like to talk about three things, which is what came to my mind first when Danilo and Manuel sent the question to us. The importance of short versus long-term approach to business, the importance of the alignment between the stakeholder interests in a company, which is something that has been already talked about, and then why I believe family businesses, which always try to look into the future towards the next generation, are probably good models to follow in order to find those answers that we are trying to find today, okay? So I will summarize by saying that all these three ideas or topics get a proper balance when you have a real purpose, okay? And when you communicate it properly and you constantly act and behave according to that purpose. So to start with the short versus long-term approach, well, we all live in this crazy world where time pressure is huge because of digitalization, because of globalization, because of, well, just the world we live in, okay? Jim is a good example of a person linked to listed companies, okay, and great big corporations. Well, quarterly results are also a reality in a family-owned business. It's not only linked to these big companies, okay? But my opinion is that when you create a company, when my grandfather started 80 years ago, well, he created the company for the long run, okay? He created the company basically forever. So why should we look at the quarterly results all the time when the purpose of a company is to last forever, okay? Then, of course, you have the analysts and the stock exchange, and there is always a temptation to please them by sending the proper messages in a press conference or in an analyst conference. And, well, this is something that I believe is a temptation also for well, persons like me, okay? I am the CEO of our company, and I also report to the board, okay? So you always want to give also good news, but this is not always possible. In our mission statement, we say that we want to grow sustainably and to provide an excellent and innovative service to the industries we serve. I would like to focus on the word sustainably, because we all understand the need to grow, okay? Every single company has this aim, especially because of the time pressure and the world we live today on. But why sustainably? Well, from our perspective, because, well, we need to be sensitive also to our own resources, okay? The equity built over 3 generations, over 80 years, of course also paying dividends to the shareholders. But, well, if these are our resources and we want to balance properly the risk we are assuming, well, you have to pay attention also to the equity to debt ratio, which is something we are very, very conscious about. We could have grown faster. We could be not a 300 million euro company, but maybe a bigger one. But hey, we're here 80 years later, and that's what we feel proud about. I get this question quite often, okay? Don't you believe that you could be less conservative, that you could maybe leverage a bit more the company? And I say, yes, probably. And maybe we would have grown more, and maybe we would not be here. But still, I always answer the same. That's why we are 80 years later here, okay? It's also a matter of sustainability to balance properly our ability to grow, okay? So we have a certain number of employees, and we want to make a proper transfer of knowledge and culture and ways of doing. We're going to talk about values, and we're going to talk about virtues, which are basically different things. But it's important to make this proper transfer of knowledge to our people. We feel very proud of what we call the Guzman style of doing things. And when we talk with our suppliers, principals, okay, we are distributors, so we represent the interest of third parties. We really like when they say, hey, we want you to do this in other parts of the world. That's how we entered into Italy, okay? We were granted the opportunity to replicate our business model there. And that's a matter of trust also. And then, of course, sustainability also in the sense of minimizing your risks, okay? We work with credit insurance because if we don't get bill paid, then it's a big issue for us, okay? Our margins are very small because we are distributors, and we need to be very sensible to this. So How do you align all these interests? Okay, I'm talking about equity, so that this is basically the shareholders. I'm talking about our ability to do it, so this is basically our people, our management, our employees. And then we are talking about minimizing risk towards payments or receivables and so on. So we're talking about also suppliers and customers. Well, I believe you do this by aligning the interest of the different shareholders. Of course, our management, we rely on professionals running the business. So our managers also have goals and have targets, and somehow you need to place these incentives, be it quarterly, be it annually, maybe long-term goals also, 3 to 5 years maybe. But it's very difficult to avoid this self-seeking that Danilo was talking about, no, in the question. Because sometimes you have this temptation, okay, to make your numbers, to make your goals, and that's very tough. When we go to the upper level, okay, so to the shareholders and the board, well, in a family-owned business, it's easier because most shareholders are somehow represented at the board. And, well, that courage or challenge that Dawn-Marie was talking about, sometimes it's easier, okay, when a shareholder is not agreeing with certain steps or certain moves of the company, they'll probably say no very fast, okay? So in our case, it's a bit simpler in that sense. But then, of course, you also have the customers and the suppliers. And here we also have several examples of, let's say, behaviors that could be considered non-purely ethical, okay? Very recently, I received a phone call from a supplier which is about to merge with another big company. And his request was, hey, we have these inventories on a consignment base. Would you mind if we invoice them to you, and then we'll give you a longer payment term just to compensate for the working capital and so on? Well, it's not truly unethical, but at the end, it's a matter of what is the goal of this person, what is the target for the company and its shareholders, which is to present these nice numbers when the merge is announced. And well, this raise plenty of concerns in our minds when saying yes or no, okay? Then we also have customers which don't want to pay the VAT, okay? Or they want a gift or somehow a compensation. And, you know, talking to your managers and explaining properly what is the behavior you expect is very important. So to end up with the third topic, which is the family businesses, okay? Well, when you talk about the next generation, you're talking about the next 30 to 40 years, okay? So as compared to the quarterly results, to the yearly results, 30 to 40 years seems just impossible to set goals or targets to that long term. But that's a reality. And I'm not talking about the family member or the family running the business, okay? Because here I differentiate properly management from governance, from shareholding. I'm generally speaking about, see, I have 3 daughters, and I always say that they will never work with daddy, okay? They ask me, and I say, no, that will not happen, okay? Because I'd rather have you being a good board member or a responsible shareholder. So when talking about these 30 to 40 years, I'm not only talking about the management itself, okay? I'm talking about the whole stakeholders. And I'm already saying this to my kids, okay, which are still 13 and 11 years old, okay? What is, at the end, what are we trying to do? How are we trying to explain this to our team, to our kids also? Well, through our values, okay, and also through those virtues that I believe Bill will explain much better than me afterwards. These ways of doing are deeply rooted in our people, okay, and it's a matter of the time you spend with them behaving and acting properly so they can somehow assimilate those ways of doing. When we started in Italy and Turkey, I spent plenty of time there, so because it was very important for me, for them, to know how we do things, okay? And that's, to finalize and summarize, that's why the purpose is so important, okay? And that's why you need to make this very clear statement. You need to explain it all the time. You need to say it. You need to write it down, okay? It's not just enough to put it in a nice presentation, okay? We are a member of the Global Compact of the United Nations for many years already. We have our Code of Conduct since 1916. We started becoming a sponsor of the Chair for Business Ethics last year. We just launched this year a big corporate social responsibility program in the company, but it's not enough. I mean, you need to remind it permanently. You need to train your people and then ask whether they really got the message and whether they really understood what the purpose is. And of course, you need to act in an exemplary way, okay? You need to really believe it and practice it. I would not really agree with Jim when he said that maybe Harvard is not doing things right, in the sense that I am attending now an executive education program at Harvard Business School, and the professor, which is always giving the opening session and the closing session, which is Anand Raman, he always says that we are here, entrepreneurs, businessmen, to do a decent profit decently, okay? And I really like this sentence. And I believe that's why we're here 80 years later, and I believe that's what really gives a meaning and an answer to the question you asked. Thank you.
Thank you, Fidel.
Thank you.
Very much. Next, we have Bill Bowman, Dean of the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America. Bill has led companies as president or CEO for over 25 years now. Previously to becoming dean, Bill was president and CEO of US Inspect in Chantilly, Virginia. US Inspect is the nation's largest home and commercial inspection company. Before that, Bill served as president of Children First Incorporated, now Bright Horizons, the nation's leading provider of backup child care services to corporations. Bill also worked for the Boston Consulting Group, BCG, and was appointed by the governor of Massachusetts as a trustee of the 5 campuses of the University of Massachusetts, remaining on the board for 6 years. He was the co-founder of the Massachusetts Software Council, past chairman of the Software Publishers Association, and former director of the Massachusetts High Technology Council. Bill is an engineering honors graduate of Northwestern University and received an MBA with distinction, also from Harvard Business School. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to talk today about virtues in business, and I'd like to address 3 questions. First of all, why are virtues important in business? I think we all have a sense that they are, but what is it that really makes them important? How can a company actually build a virtue-based culture? And then finally, what's the impact of doing all of this on a company's financial return? So first, why are virtues important in a business? No matter how hard we try, compliance programs with its system of punishments and rewards simply can't do the whole job of guiding employees to behave ethically. We really have to have employees who modify their behavior themselves and do what they know is the right thing, and that's responding to good habits that they developed in the process of becoming a virtuous worker. Aristotle defines virtue as a disposition to behave in the right manner and as a mean between the extremes of deficiency and excess, which are vices. We learn moral virtue primarily through habit and practice rather than through reasoning and instruction. So you can't become a virtuous person just simply by reading about it. You actually become a virtuous person by practicing acts of virtue. So if you want to become a generous person, you can read all the books you like, but that won't make you a generous person. But if you go out and you begin to practice acts of generosity, it gets easier and easier and easier, and that's really what the process of taking this virtue and actually living it is all about. It becomes a habit. In his recent book, Power of Habit, Charles Duhigg extends our understanding of virtue by noting recent trends in neurology, looking at how the brain responds to a practice of behavior over and over. He found that cranial activity that drives us to overeat doesn't go away when we successfully diet. What happens is that the new activity, successfully dieting, actually grows in power and eventually takes over the space in the neural development of our respond to things of this sort. And that makes it easier to say no to the habit of just taking that extra piece of cake. So it's not going away, but we're actually building up defenses in neurology to help us to behave virtuously. So these recent studies of the brain really help us to understand the science behind the formation of virtue and why practice is such a key part. The brain needs exercise just as we do in the rest of our bodies. And when we extend these lessons from a single person to an entire business, we can also observe all sorts of other good things happening, which include, it was a surprise to me, we've done 2 of these now, it was a surprise to me, but the financial outcomes improved dramatically. And I'll talk a little bit about why that might be. So the second issue is, how do we build a virtues-based business? We've actually thought a lot about this, we being a group of us at Catholic University, and I'll be launching a new company in May, actually, to do this work in private corporations. But we have this 5-step process, and the first step is simply to go out and talk to all the customers. It's always good to talk to customers. You just learn a lot. We all know that. But we just ask one simple question to those customers, which is, what do you most value about the work that we do for you? And people just write down short little phrases. You know, we really appreciate that your home inspectors show up early. We love the way that your teachers are so compassionate with the children in the child care center. Whatever it happens to be, we'll just take all of these back, and then we sit down with those responses and map them into one of 130 human virtues that we've unearthed. So there's a lot of different ways to really approach becoming a virtue-based business, but we thought talking to customers was really important, and then mapping all of these responses back to this list of 131 virtues so that we really understood which were most important. Then we simply sort them, and we say, okay, we can't do 131 things, let's try to do 5. So we pick the top 5 virtues, and then we actually go and begin a process of training to help all of the employees in that company practice acts of each of those 5 virtues, so that they actually will grow in the things that customers really value. That's a very simple idea. So to give you an example, the top five human virtues for Children First, which was the child care company here in Boston, were patience, tolerance, optimism, commitment, and perseverance. And you can look at each of those virtues and say, wow, that makes a lot of sense. I'd like teachers in my that were working with my kids in a child care center to have each of those virtues. That makes a lot of sense. When we did the same work at US Inspect, the home inspection company, we didn't know what we'd get. You know, maybe they're the same 5, maybe they're different. Well, they were wildly different, completely different, because the work is completely different, obviously. They were diligence, dependability, honesty, knowledge, and charity. So that's what we were going to do then for the home inspectors, is to concentrate on, let's go through practices of each of those 5 virtues, just as we did at Children First. Very different virtues, very different practices. So that's the 4th step, is really to learn the virtue. And we felt it was very important to understand the virtue in light of history, look at it in the culture, look at short stories about the virtue. The neat thing about virtues is they go back a long way. This is not a Christian concept. This goes all the way back 300 years before the Christian era to Aristotle, and in front of that beyond that to the Chinese. So these ideas have been around an awfully long time, so learning about them is really important. And we felt telling the story about perseverance from the standpoint of Abe Lincoln, who, I didn't know this, but he ran for all sorts of different offices and lost and lost and lost and lost and lost. And then he finally won the big one. But it was that act of just really going after that one virtue that really got him where he had to go. And the 5th and final step then is practicing the virtue, and this is the key part. So without practice, you can't acquire a virtue. So how would you practice patience if you were a child care worker? Well, as parents, we all kind of have a sense of what that looks like, and I mentioned the 5 virtues that made a lot of sense there. So our goal really was to create a set of practices around each virtue, and then to get to work developing the habits that would enable us to acquire those virtues and become a virtuous person. Let me now turn to the 3rd area, which is the impact of building this virtuous substrate on the financial returns of the company. We had no interest, frankly, and no idea that there was a relationship between building a company based on virtue and financial returns. But there was, and that was marvelous news to us, because if we can go to CEOs and say, well, here's something you should do for your employees because it's the right thing to do, and here's something you should do for society because it's the right thing to do, but if you can also say your financial returns are going to improve and your payback period is going to be 6 months, well, my goodness, you've got the attention of that executive. So we ran 2 pilots one in childcare, as I mentioned, the other in home inspection, and we're absolutely amazed by the improvement in the financial performance. In the childcare company, employee turnover fell 33%, which was worth, in that particular company, $200,000 a year. Not just 1 year, but forever, just, that improvement in turnover. And as you know, we have 7 million unfilled jobs here in the United States right now, no workers to fill those jobs, and so every executive is just trying to figure out, how can I keep my employees right now? Well, here's a program that you can use to do that. In the home inspection company, we had a sort of a cost bleeder that was killing us, which was errors in doing the home inspection. We'd miss a room, you'd close on your house, and you'd come back to us saying, hey, there's all sorts of mold over here, why didn't you notice that? Well, we'd have to go back and remediate that and fix it and everything, and that was costing us a ton of money. But after this program, it was unbelievable. Our costs for repairs plummeted 80%, which saved us almost $1 million a year. Not once, but every single year. So we were also able to talk about this program to others, and it made a big difference to Target and Goldman Sachs that we believed in these sorts of issues. So in summary, virtues-based companies benefit by having employees really focusing on ethical behavior through virtue, and this behavior not only improves the company culture, but also can improve its financial position. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Bill. And finally, Dr. Donna Hicks, who is an associate at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs here at Harvard University, and previously was the deputy director of the program of international conflict analysis and resolution at the Weatherhead Center at Harvard. Donna has been involved in numerous unofficial diplomatic conflict resolution efforts, including projects in the Middle East, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Colombia, Cuba, and Northern Ireland. She was a consultant to the BBC, where she co-facilitated a television series, Facing the Truth, with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, which aired in the UK and on BBC World. She has taught conflict resolution at Harvard, Clark, and Columbia universities, and conducts training seminars in the Dignity Model, a human-centered approach to rebuilding conflict relationships in the US and abroad. Donna, in 2000, authored a book, Dignity, Its Essential Role in Resolving Conflict. And in 2018, she published a new book, a sort of a sequel to that book, called Leading with Dignity, How to Create a Culture that Brings Out the Best in People, also published by Yale University Press, and is a recent recipient of a prestigious Association of American Publishers award. Yes. And Donna, I also think, has been at all of our colloquia. So it's, I guess, fitting that we're ending this first part with Donna's comments. So
thank you,
please take it
Danilo.
away.
Thank you. And thank you, my fellow panelists. That were really thought-provoking remarks. We could just stop here, and I think all of us would be full. But thank you. I'm gonna actually say a few things, but mostly about Mike. And the impact that Mike Hoffman had on my work, and the relationship that I established with the center, with Mary and Gail and Robert and others. And it was here, the very first time I met Mike Hoffman was here at our first colloquium. And I remember him sitting, like right where you're sitting, and whenever anyone was talking, he had this penetrating listening style. You could tell he was taking everything in and grappling with it. And after my presentation, and when the colloquium was finished and we had the Q&A, he came up to me and he said, I really appreciate what you're doing, and there's such alignment between our work at the center in ethics in business and the work that you're doing, and I'd love to talk to you more about the correspondences between our approaches. And I said, sure, great. And he invited me to go to Bentley, and we went to the cafeteria there and sat for about a 2-hour lunch. It must have been at least that, at least it felt that way to me. And he was telling me about his remarkable history, where he was really the father of business ethics in many ways, started the whole movement, and sharing all of his, of course, he was very humble about it. He never he wasn't really blowing his horn, but only to give me a sense of what his background was and how our work purposes really were in alignment. And so we were going on and on at that time. And I remember the closing thing that he said to me after I explained all my dignity work and the things that I had been doing in the workplace, trying to understand how to address some of the dysfunctional aspects of the work environments. And then he said to me at the end, he said, Donna, there are no ethics without dignity. And so that launched a 7-year friendship and collaboration back and forth. And it was after another colloquium where Sandra Waddick, who's sitting right back there, she and I were on a panel. We shared a panel together, and I don't remember who else was on it. But Sandra was giving a talk about her work on wisdom and her work on intellectual shamans, and I could see Mike just riveted by what she was saying. And then I gave my presentation about dignity and how important it was for all of us to understand the crucial role it plays in our lives and how we all want to be treated as if we mattered. And I think, Sandra, you and I were quite passionate about in our presentations. And so after that, Sandra and I get a phone call from, maybe it was Mary, saying, Donna, Mike wants to have a conversation with you and Sandra. It was, oh, okay, great, right? Remember this conversation we had, a conference call? And so he said, we have this Verizon lecture series, and we really want you and Sandra to share the presentation on ethical leadership in the 21st century. So, I know we were just thrilled, weren't we? We were delighted, and he was suggesting ways that our work on wisdom and dignity could be woven together, and we were just thrilled. And not to mention the fact that it helped our friendship. Sandra and I became good friends, and we've been friends ever since. But I want to, and the other thing that lecture did, it was great. It was at Bentley. We had a wonderful turnout. It was just, for me, it was one of the highlights of doing this work in the workplace, meeting up with all of the fellows and the Verizon people and certainly Sandra and everything else that led to. But we ended up writing a paper, and that paper was entitled Dignity, Wisdom, and Tomorrow's Ethical Business Leaders. And that's the topic that he wanted us to address. And I just want to read you Michael's introduction. There's just a very short introduction, what he wrote, but I think it's profound, and I think it speaks volumes to who he was and how he imagined the impact of trying to develop ethical leaders who understood dignity and wisdom. So he was talking about the lecture that we gave, and he said the lecture came at an auspicious moment at the Center for Business Ethics. It was at the time when it was announcing that in 2006, it will celebrate the 40th anniversary. And as we reflect back on 4 decades of advancing business ethics, say that fast, the time is also fitting that through this lecture, we get back to our roots and recall what business ethics is at its essence. It was not long ago that the word ethics was seen as unrelated to the word business, and that disconnect, the door was open wide to all sorts of corruption in that disconnect. Two other words that also are not often associated with business, but should be, are wisdom and dignity. When we fail to see the vital role of wisdom and dignity in the conduct of business, the result is an impoverished understanding of business. If 40 years of relentless study of business ethics has shown us anything, it is that when one narrows one's view of business as simple pursuit of profits, corruption and danger follow as surely as night follows day. By contrast, when business is infused with the ideas of honoring humanity, such as wisdom and dignity, the capacity of business to contribute to social flourishing is colossal and a testimony to human genius. Doctors Hicks and Waddick have done us a service by reminding us that in pursuit of business ethics, we are affirming something deep and noble that can and should be a part of doing business. As we at the Center celebrate our 4 decades of work, it is refreshing and humbling to return to the core values of wisdom and dignity that are foundational to the ethical conduct of business. I mean, he basically summed it up here. You know, I don't even know why, we didn't even have to write anything, Sandra, but I mean, just that, and this was what he had. Michael had this vision and ability to articulate where the gaps were and how the connections could be made. And he did it so humbly, and he did it so generously. And I also want to make a connection between the word dignity and generosity. I had a fellow who was working with me, a Fulbright scholar who was working with me from Morocco, who spoke Arabic. She was, from Morocco, and she told me that in Arabic, the word dignity means generosity.
Wow.
It just kind of woke up a part of my brain that I hadn't really thought of before. And I thought about Mike in that context. I thought about how he lived his life with dignity. There wasn't a moment that I understood him, that I knew him in our interactions, where he didn't really look at everybody he dealt with as someone of value and worth, and treated us that way. So that's where that generosity, I guess that's one of the virtues you probably look at too, right? Generosity. So what is it about the understanding of dignity that contributes to ethical leadership? These are the things that we talked about, Mike and I. And I think the very basic idea that I want to impart is that we are all born with dignity. Every faith community, every religious tradition has some aspect of dignity, that we were born with it. It's, in Catholicism and Christianity, of course, we're born in the image and likeness of God. But it's not just limited to Christianity. All the faith communities have some mention of dignity and having to honor the value and worth of each human being. And so, but here's the catch. Even though we're all born with dignity, we're not born knowing how to act like it. And this is where the role of education comes in, that Mike understood so profoundly. This is the role of education. And I loved what you just said about reading about these virtues and wanting to say, okay, I've read this book about all these virtues, therefore I am. No, you have to practice, practice, practice. And it's the thing of, oh, you're kidding me, already 2 minutes, holy smokes. Okay, so that's fine. And when I go into a workplace and do a consultation about dignity, it is shocking to me, absolutely shocking, how ignorant most people are of the concept. And they say, dignity, well, we really haven't thought about that. Well, what, everybody's born with dignity? Sure, yeah, that's great. Okay, right. And so my big takeaway is that this ignorance gap is really one of the contributors to why people make those kind of unethical decisions that you pointed out, Dawn Marie. And one of the big problems, I think, is that knowing that human beings don't like to look bad in the eyes of others. And we will do whatever it takes to not look bad, to cover up our mistakes, to deceive ourselves, to, lie, and you were mentioning blaming and shaming others, to deflect your guilt. This is a fundamental aspect of what it means to be human, and it works against our acting as if we had dignity. And so, but understanding these basic ideas about where dignity comes from and what the dignity obstacles are to our living a life of dignity, knowing when we have to say, hey, wait a minute, especially as ethical leaders, we made a mistake here. We made a mistake either in our policy, we made a mistake in our judgment, we made a mistake in the way we've treated certain groups in our organization, whatever it is, that's what it takes to actually create an environment where people feel safe, people feel they can, be their authentic selves. So with good ethical leadership and the link to dignity, and I'll close with this idea, is that I read somewhere, and Manolo and I were trying to decide where this was. I think it might have been Kant, but I think also Michael Rosen, who wrote a book about dignity, mentioned this, and that is, how do you know you've got dignity? How do you feel it? Not intellectually here, but how do you know you have dignity? And we know, and this person, whether it was Kant or Michael Rosen himself, he said, we know we have dignity when we choose to do what's right. Because that's often a very difficult choice, especially your examples, Donna Marie. So that's, if you want to feel your dignity, do what's right. Do the right thing. Thank you.
So just briefly before we take a break, first of all, thank you very much to those of you who've made, who told us a little bit more about Michael Hoffman and your comments. Those much appreciated. I did not know him either, but it was really wonderful. Thank you. I want to thank our presenters, especially our new first-time presenters, for referencing our previous colloquia. It was very nice to see that, and your comments build on that and contribute to the overall conversation. Thank you. And then thank you for your own rich and thoughtful presentations. That's a lot to think about, and I hope now we can, the 15-minute break, think about some of the, formulate questions that you would like to ask to our presenters, our panelists, but there'll be a part at the end where you can talk to each other or ask each other questions as well. So that we'll reconvene at 11:15. We're running a little bit late, but that's okay. See you in about 20 minutes then, I guess. 20-minute break.
Great.
Thanks. Great. Well, welcome back, everyone. And I would like to open it up to questions right away. Please introduce yourselves. I see Leon's hand already went up. Introduce yourself briefly, affiliation, and then that's it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Leon Goldman. I'm an executive fellow at the Hoffman Center for Business Ethics. First, let me thank all of you for just a fantastic session. I have not so much a question as two observations that you can comment on or not. One is, we talked a lot about training the board, training the senior leadership, training the employees, the line managers. We also talked about short-term pressure. We live in systems, but we tend to silo our lives. The system that we live in includes the shareholders. Should we be training our shareholders too? I have no answer. I leave that as a question. The other is a comment of practicing virtues. And I'm sure that it's inherent in your statement, Mr. Bowman. But I would like to articulate that we need to practice our virtues in the pursuit of dignity and empathy. Because if perseverance is a virtue, I can practice it. I can practice to be a great liar, to deny I ever did anything wrong. I can get so good at it that everybody believes me. But I think we'd all agree that by being a virtuous liar, I'm really not being virtuous. So that was my other observation.
Very good.
Do you want a response, Leon?
If not, that's okay too.
Well, I'll give you mine. I had a conversation with Frank at the break about the attention to shareholders in the last 25 years, and I don't think we can train shareholders. I think what we've seen is, with the start of the 401ks and, IRAs, and we have the last decades of people used to being in the market with their savings for retirement, for college, for whatever. I mean, I think the vehicles we have, certainly in the United States, and I know in Europe as well, are good. But I think it has occasioned shareholders and investors and all of us to look at what's happening to our savings. And you can educate them maybe on the risk-reward spectrum, but I think educate them the way you're talking, I don't think so. And I think particularly, we talk about ethical scandals. We could spend another colloquium on this, but since 2008, I live in the foreclosure capital, of the United States, where people today have not recovered from losing their homes and their savings and everything else. So my answer is, unfortunately, I don't think we can. I don't know that that's the answer, but I'd love to hear what Frank has to say or anybody else.
Can I comment on ethics? Oh, I'm sorry, are you going to speak, Frank? I'm sorry. I was just going to comment on empathy, Leon. I think it's incredibly important, and one of the things you risk when you don't read your notes, actually, is speaking to what you wanted to speak to. I was going to mention, referring to last year's colloquium, the emphasis on dignity and virtue was very apparent in that colloquia. And I do think they're at the heart of emotional intelligence, and to be able to lead well, you have to have emotional intelligence. And I think that it's stunning how few people actually study anything to do with emotional intelligence. They don't even know the terms to use. That actually self-awareness is a way to become more confident as a leader, very counterintuitively. Humility is actually a path to confidence. Vulnerability is a path to confidence. And these are the sorts of soft topics that I think we need to start dealing with in leadership rather than focusing on management and the skills of management. So I think you're absolutely correct, and I think, Donna's reference to dignity kind of being part of the start of that. What Bill did at Catholic University is so cool. With the four, which you need to talk about, some of you may know about, but to teach business through the lens of the Catholic social doctrine, which, by the way, he had to explain to me as a lifelong Catholic about 3 years ago. And it includes the dignity of the human person. That's one of the 4 pillars of the Catholic social doctrine. If you get that in your head, that as a leader, you actually have to pay attention to that, solidarity, subsidiarity, distribution of goods. It actually has to be understood cognitively first. You have to actually understand what virtue is first, then start practicing that moral muscle. But you have to understand it first. And we don't do a lot of talking about what it is. Anyway.
Donna, did you
Yeah,
want
I
to, before
wanted to say, and maybe Bob does too, or Bill rather, wants to say something about practicing in the pursuit of dignity and empathy. I think one of the things that I didn't get to say, because I rambled on too much during my presentation, was that in my mind, I've developed this notion that dignity consciousness, being really aware, understanding it from the inside out, not just a cognitive understanding of it, but dignity awareness when leaders or any of us understand that dignity is really being connected to our own dignity, number one. The vast majority of people with whom I work when I do consultations, as I said before, don't even know that they have dignity. So one, getting people connected to their own inherent value and worth is really a critical factor in dignity education. But the other is understanding and connecting with the dignity of other people, recognizing that if I've got dignity, so does everybody else. This is just part of the human condition. But third is recognizing that there's a greater good out there. There's something greater and bigger than just ourselves. And that could be a higher power, our creator, if you're in a, thinking of this in a religious framework. But in terms of being a part of an organization, being part of a company or being an employee, if you have a sense that, that's the purpose that you were talking about too, if you have a sense that you're working for an organization that is contributing to the greater good, that cares about how the impact that the company or the organization has on people, that's the service of, in pursuit of what I call it the greater good. So dignity is about those 3 things. And if you're practicing a virtue, like Bill was saying, or in Leon's point, in the service of something self-preserving or self-interested reasons or, greed or whatever, well, you can practice, and you'll probably serve that purpose of yours, that little narrow purpose. But if we want to do really profound, meaningful work and have a fulfilled life, we need to have those 3 connections done. It's in pursuit of all 3 of those. And I have to say, Rita, where's Rita? Where'd she go? Rita sent, oh, there you are. Rita sent me a Forbes article about you, about Jim, which was so great. I encourage you all to look at it. But he said something about, at the end of the article, someone was interviewing him. It said, "We were not put here by God to be good. We were put here to do good." And I think that's really what this is about pursuit of, something better, a greater, and a better kind of way of being together in the world. So I want to
I'm
thank you.
glad that she didn't mention the slides I took to the Pope.
Oops.
I think Frank was mentioned, and he wants to just follow up.
My name's
briefly,
Frank
and then we'll-
Daly.
Thank you. Yep.
I'm actually an executive fellow at the Hoffman Center for Business Ethics. Have been for a long time. I'm in my third or fourth life, actually, by the way. But one of the interesting things is 25 years ago, I worked in a major aerospace company as the ethics officer. And all of a sudden, we were told that we need to change our attitudes for shareholder value. And the question then became, what does that mean? So when I heard what it meant, I saw it as a turnaround. For instance, before shareholder value, you made a good product, you served your client, you had good relationships with the community, you treated your employees well, et cetera. Then all of a sudden, and as a result of that, the shareholders benefited. But with shareholder value, it was turned around and the shareholder went to the front. And if you had to cut employee benefits, if you had to short circuit some of the things for your customer, et cetera. So I went to the chief financial officer and said, you know, we're telling individuals not to cut corners, not to come late, not to do this. And then we're sending this corporate cultural message that says, as a matter of fact, that we ought to all do all these kinds of things that essentially are apart from the ethics that we've used before. And I didn't hear a lot of talk about culture. And one of the things Mike Hoffman was known for was when the U.S. Sentencing Commission in 1991 was going to put out their new guidelines and totally ignore the notion of culture, just compliance. Mike got people together and actually convinced them to include an evaluation of what the culture of the operation is. So it is a wonderful thing to tell people stories like about Abraham Lincoln, et cetera, whom we all as a virtuous man. The question is, do the executives of the company exude in the messages they send and the way that they operate the kind of dignity that in fact they're trying to teach to their employees?
If I could just address that, I think we're at an interesting time where we have an opportunity to perhaps go back to the right definition of what a corporation is all about. You know, what we teach at Catholic University is very much what you're talking about here, which is that the person is the purpose of a business and not the dollar. The dollars follow, but the person is the purpose of a business. And why is that? It's that people have an inherent dignity that is just beyond any other element in the means of production. And we can't treat human beings the same way as we do factories or something else. We have to treat them, they have an, you know, in the Christian standpoint, they have an eternal soul. So we have to have that attitude. And if we have that attitude, that puts the person as a central purpose of the business and not the dollar. The dollars, as I mentioned, follow, and they always do if you do this right. So this is a message that I think at a time when, again, we'll go back to this 7 million open jobs right now, that executives are kind of refocusing on what's going on in their companies in terms of people. And they're realizing they can't get away with this anymore, and this might be an opportune time to really try to push that message out a little bit more.
I might mention too on that very topic, Christine and I were speaking about this. I teach Enron as one element of my course, simply as a way to acquaint them with what regulations were and governance mechanisms came down the road after that. But one of the things I teach directly in conjunction with that case is a stakeholder perspective piece that Darden wrote, and the Darden Business School did. And it talks about this issue of shareholder primacy. Lynn White is a fabulous lawyer who actually took on the notion that shareholder primacy was actually a legal construct. It's not. Her claim is it's not at all. It just became popular. The problem we have today, we were talking about this, is that the litigation, the case law in Delaware courts now has been built up around protecting directors for protecting debt and equity interests. So in some ways, you can't completely ignore it, especially if the shareholder base doesn't change, but you can do it in conjunction with these other things. And she has a really cool idea about how to score that, if you will, because that actually could start changing shareholder minds and the way that they look at things. But that whole shift to shareholder primacy, you're absolutely right about. And I think one of the things we've got to do as part of the education and training is acquaint people with actually what are their legal responsibilities. I'll tell you what happened in Enron, though. They were very shareholder-centric, right? But they also were 30-day shareholder-centric. So you've also got this issue, even if you believe in shareholder prime, is who is the shareholder?
I'm Paula Gutlove. Do you want me to stand up? Or?
If you don't mind, yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm Paula Gutlove. I teach negotiation and leadership at Simmons University and the School of Business. I also teach at Harvard Medical School and Holt, and I'm going to be teaching at Bentley Saturday at the Center for Women in Business. And I want to applaud the whole panel. It was a fantastic conversation. Fidel, I particularly liked your point that it's important to have a mission, important to have purpose. And a couple of years ago, Manuel, in our colloquium, spoke about the importance of having a mission and a purpose that was greater than oneself. And we know that in business, people who feel they have purpose are happier. It's not the salary, it's not the money that they're earning up to a certain point, but the feeling that they matter and that what they do is important to the greater good, as Donna said. And the culture is where we get our values. The culture of the organization, the culture of the business is what dictates the values. And as Dawn said, the board is critical. So in thinking about culture, thinking about purpose, and thinking about boards, I have a question for Dawn, but also for the whole board, for the whole board, for the whole group, for the whole panel. And that is that
Sure one of us disagrees with whatever she says, or else it's not a healthy board.
absolutely. And remember that I come from the perspective of teaching women, because Simmons is a women's college, a women's university now. We've just changed from a college to a university. So. And we know that the culture of boards dictates the values of the boards and the behavior of the boards. So there is a movement to increase diversity and inclusion on boards. And in Europe, there's a mandated quota for the number of women to serve on boards. There's been discussion about women on boards in the United States. I would like to hear your perspectives on increasing the diversity of boards in the United States and how this will affect ethics and leadership. Thank you.
Well, I might surprise you on that. I mean, you know, I probably have a 50-year history of being a left-wing feminist. And I've served on a lot of boards. And I've served on boards in which I think issues of trust and candor are more important than diversity. I loved your phrase about humility as a path to confidence, because sometimes you don't have the confidence to say to your peers in executive session, I didn't get that. And the boards that I serve on, it's just as likely to be the guys who will say, I didn't get that. Anybody else troubled by that? Let's spend more time talking about that. I think that the initiative to mandate women on boards is horrible, just horrible, because I have heard comments and seen it happen that board members, including some women, will say, she's senior vice president at the company because the company doesn't have enough women at the top, and we all think she's really terrible, but they don't dare fire her. So, you know, she's got golden handcuffs. And I think if you have a requirement that there's so many women on a board, the women who come in pursuant to that requirement. No one will say it, but they'll look and say, okay, she's just there because we're required to have some. And, you know, I've sat on boards where, honestly, I think the women are fabulous. There's no question. They don't mind asking. They're aggressive. They're talented. They're great. And I've been on a board in which you know, you talk about the culture of a board, and the one director who was out of the culture and who was a real irritant, unfortunately, was a woman, and we were all so happy when she left. So I think it's a better argument to say, if we don't look for, let's just take women on board, you're missing 50% of the talent pool. That's an argument, to me, that's more effective. Go ahead, disagree with me.
Well, I think it actually is appealing to things like that. It's increasingly, no matter how technical your business is, there are more women working in these companies, even in engineering and science roles, geoscience, in our business. If you don't have board members that look like them, why should they believe they can get anywhere? I mean, I just think it's actually a
Yeah.
practical issue for boards to be focused on. Same with senior executives, not promoting people who don't deserve it, but simply taking account, and I think it's CEO-led personally. At least my experience is it had to be started that way. Then you build the culture of acceptance. We had 5 people that were gonna be a chief engineer in a company I ran, and one of them was a woman. And I said, is she as good as the rest? And they said, yeah, but this is the 2 we prefer. They were men. I said, we're taking the woman. I had to hear first she was just as good. And then she ended up being our first division vice president. We did the same with the chief accounting officer. So it's got to be a conscious effort, not mandated by government, but just people knowing they've got to do it, because it's stupid not to do it.
I fully agree with Jim. I mean, we had a similar experience. We had to change a board member recently, and it's not that we're narrowing the focus, but if you have an equal a number of potential board directors and one of them is women, then hey, bring her on board. So we have 7 board members, 2 of them are women. So we're still lagging behind the mandate, but it's true. It raises awareness, and at the end, you take the decision, and we're very satisfied about it.
The gentleman behind Manuel, yes.
Hi, my name's John Sherman. I'm a Bentley Executive Fellow. I'm also General Counsel and Senior Advisor to SHIFT, which is a nonprofit in the area of business and human rights. And I was the Senior Legal Advisor to Professor John Ruggie, who is the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General on Business and Human Rights, and was responsible for authoring the UN Guiding Principles. And before that, I was a corporate lawyer, and so I had executive responsibilities at National Grid for ethics and safety, as well as all of their litigation. So I want to ask about something that the panel has talked about, which are the values of empathy and respect and dignity, which are at the heart of international human rights. It's actually at the core. And my question is really what the role is of business ethics with respect to persons who are injured at the remote tiers of company supply chains. They're people, but they don't work for the company. Just to give you an anecdote, at National Grid, we had some terrible accidents in around 2000, one involving 3 people who were horribly injured. One died at our substation in Everett, just a couple of miles away. And this caused a wholesale revision and examination and soul searching of our safety culture. And it got everybody's attention. Why? Because we knew those people. They were our brothers and sisters. And the ones who survived stayed with us. And everybody was galvanized. We had empathy with them because we knew they were people. So now you start to look at the company supply chain, however. You look at the procurement people who are responsible for buying stuff all over the world. what's their empathy with people in India who make manhole covers that are used on the streets in Boston and Cambridge? Well, they tend to have worked in terrible conditions, naked in environments of 110 degrees, without any personal protection equipment. Now, these are people, but the remoteness between those people and those in the corporate offices in Westboro and London, they're not considered one of us. And that, I think, is the impetus behind the UN guiding principles. Mm-hmm. So now I've kept a foot in business ethics through the center, and I struggle with trying to identify what the right role is of business ethics in addressing harm to people who are remote from the company. And I'd be curious to get your views on that.
I can give you a quote. Do you have something you want to talk about? Because
I do.
you do, go.
No, you go.
No, I've talked a lot.
Oh, so have I.
No fighting.
There are a lot of companies that do exactly that actually today. And it's a sad thing that what you don't do is you don't address the individual worker, you fire the actual company, sadly. It doesn't ultimately help the individual worker because you can't, from a litigation perspective, put yourself in those shoes. But you do count it, you actually track it, you care about it. Your vendors or suppliers are held to the same safety standards that you are held to, same environmental standards. And if they don't perform, they get fired. And that's the only way I've seen it done. I do think that, back to maybe Patrick, the comment that Frank made about culture, I think a good culture in a leadership team would be one that cares about collecting that data. They actually care about what is the safety record of the people that provide services to us, or what are the conditions under which they work. And the minute they hear that something's wrong, they just tune into it. It's like recognizing moral moments. One of the problems we have in ethics, people aren't trained to recognize moral moments. And they're not trained to, like Bill was saying, to actually exercise that moral muscle. They don't see it as this NDA thing that I think Dawn Marie was talking about. They don't recognize this as a really cheap, easy way to exercise moral muscle. Recognize every single moral moment where you can actually make a decision that actually builds that up. So I think that's part of a culture.
So can I?
Yeah, no, of course. Just.
So there's this empathy research that I found when I was writing my book on leading with dignity. And the empathy factor is absolutely critical in keeping people connected to the dignity of others. As I said, there's 3 connections. And, but this empathy research was really quite startling, and it made me very upset. And it had to do with power and status. And what the finding... Is this the Milgram? No, not the Milgram study. This is recent. Milgram was way back in the 50s, I think, right? Yeah. But this research showed that the higher status and the more power people achieved, the less likely they were to empathize. And that was shocking to me.
It's called the power paradox.
Yeah. And we haven't really talked too much about power here, the dynamics of power and what that does to things like dignity, what that does to the culture. And I think what we have to recognize, if we're going to, this is what I do when I go into an organization, a company or a corporation, I make sure that the leadership team, the top leadership team, the executive leadership team understands everything about dignity. I share all of my research with them on dignity. And then one of the most important things, I think, for them to grasp is that even though we differ in status, there's hierarchical structures within organizations. We all have them. And a lot of power is focused at the top, concentrated at the top. But the fact is, we may be different in status, but we are all equal in dignity. And so if your organization really embodies that, he's going to care about the guy in India or the woman in Bangladesh or wherever it leads down that supply chain, who is having a problem and who is hurting as a consequence of some failed policy of the of the company. So it's really an extension of this notion, do you really believe that we are all born equal in dignity? And, you know, I ask people straight out that. Do you believe this? Or do you believe that your executive leadership team is more important in terms of human dignity? And we have a discussion about that. And I just think having that kind of discussion is so important, no matter what environment you're in, because it does, and you know, when empathy is broken, that's when all sorts of morbid things happen. Horrible things that we can justify. And we don't feel the impact that it has on that guy in India. So this is what we want to, you know, promote in our thinking and practice, you know, to underscore Bill's idea. How do we practice that as in leadership roles? What does that look like? Well, it certainly would be a violation of human rights, but it's also a violation of the inherent human dignity as well.
A follow-up from Leon.
Just to follow up on what John said, and to take it a step further, the fellows recently had a forum in which we discussed ethical culture. But Joan Dubinsky, who's one of the fellows and who has worked with the UN and with the IMF, pointed out something that I was unaware of, and I think most people in the United States are unaware of. There's a growing pressure on global corporations, because of the increasing number of failed states in the world, that it's falling to the corporations to provide the services the governments can no longer provide to their people of health, education, safety. And one of the great pressures now growing on some of these global corporations is, even if they have empathy and they wish to, there are resource limitations they have and obligations outside that country. And they're struggling with this problem of how to deal with it and how to support these people, and yet how do they remain as a viable corporation? And it's something that, you know, it's a step beyond John's, it's in your supply chain. This is, they may not even be in your supply chain, but you happen to be in the country, and it's part of your success that the country doesn't fall apart totally, but how far can you go to provide those government services that are no longer available?
Thank you for that. Yep. There's a question right here. Back to here comes the mic. Yep.
Gail.
Gail, yeah, thank you.
You know, while Gail was getting ready, I might just address, in Mozambique, when we worked there, we didn't trust the government to actually do anything with the social services fees we paid. So we actually distributed medical kits through the Catholic Archdiocese in Mozambique. So there's also a condition where the government literally steals the money you give them for social services. And what do you do to augment that as a responsible corporate citizen? Sorry.
I'm Gail O'Brien. I'm an executive fellow. I wanted to follow up on something Donna said and ask her, and if any of you have an observation. We're talking about trust indirectly today. We haven't mentioned the word very often, but it is clearly a consummate outcome of what you're talking about. When you talked about empathy and being inherently tied to dignity, I was thinking about how trust is something that is inherently tied to empathy as well. And Gallup and a lot of others have an annual study, and the trust of the people, the public around the world in business is generally pretty low, slightly better than trusting elected officials. I don't know why, you know. The challenge, I think, is that reputation is something that is uppermost, I think, on executives' minds, even if their actions don't always go through the lens of what kind of unintended consequence will ruin our reputation. But trust is something I think people inherently assume they have, and therefore they're not worried about losing it when they make decisions. So I'm wondering how you, Donna, and others might give counsel to what might go into changing that paradigm for people.
So I'm so glad you asked that, because I did have that in my fourth page that I ignored, because I think trust has to be earned, Gail. And just like respect, I think respect also has to be earned, whereas dignity is something we all have no matter what. But trust, the thing about trust is there's one of my elements of dignity is safety, that people have to feel safe in their, let's say, in their work environment. But it's not safe physically safety. It's safe to speak up when something bad happens to them. So if they're in a work environment, if people are in a work environment and they don't feel safe to speak up when their dignity is violated, especially by their bosses or by their supervisors, trust is the first thing that goes in that situation. And it's really hard to rebuild trust once the culture is infected with this, this virus and this dysfunction of not being able to say, hey, wait a minute, what happened to me was wrong. I shouldn't have been treated that way. So trust and safety, in my mind, is very, very closely aligned. We have to create these cultures, like Frank was saying. What is the essence of a good functional culture? It's a culture where people feel that they're valued, they're seen, they're heard, they're recognized, they're acknowledged, they're treated fairly, all of these things. And when any of those things go, trust goes right out the window. So I'm very, very clear that those two things, we have to think about trust and safety in the same breath.
I can, I love to give examples. So I can give an example of what
Perfect.
you were talking about, because just your description made me think of it. When I was a young executive, I reported directly to a CEO, and I didn't grow up in the corporation. I came into the corporation, and I didn't know better. But I figured out after a while that everyone was terrified of him. Some of the executives would go out of their way never to run into him. And he would go after you like a woodpecker, right? So you come into his office to tell him something, and he'd go, and he'd ask you a million questions. He'd find the one thing you didn't know. He'd throw him out. And so nobody felt safe with him. Nobody trusted, to be around him. And so he retired. A new CEO came in. And the first thing everybody noticed was that when he walked down the hall, he would pick up a piece of paper if he saw it lying there. So sure enough, everybody else started picking up paper when they were walking down the hall. And his new idea was to take the management board off to a 3-day retreat in which we were going to be closeted with each other to critique each other's areas. Well, let me tell you, the first time we did it, it was like having our fingernails pulled out one by one. It was so horrible. But we realized what he was doing was to gradually get our candor level and trust level with each other up. So we did this every year, and finally we all said, this is the most valuable thing we do. Because it was a brilliant idea. So I contrast those two CEOs, and we felt safe to speak up. We felt safe to criticize our peers. So it was
Thank you.
exactly what you're
Perfect.
talking about.
Perfect example, thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for all your views today. My name is Jean-Pierre Peinado. I'm a Spanish-Venezuelan engineer, and I've been trained in conflict management at the program of negotiation at Harvard Law School. I wanted to invite your thoughts on process, basically. Of all the examples that you gave today, I'm thinking about when there is unethical behavior or wrongdoing, whatever of these things. We talk about awareness, then concern, then action, going through all these steps. And we could talk about businesses, we can talk about governments, which are another way of thinking of boards of directors. But you said something, Mr. Driscoll, that that really struck me. The no big deal barrier. In this moment, which we know there's something happening. It's happening in Iran or Venezuela. It's no big deal, but now it's happening in Arizona. That would maybe promote a little more of the action or the concern, right? But as scholars and students, are we condemned to see this in a past tense? Are we condemned to see all these processes as history? To learn for the future, sure, but is there any way, and if none of you answer, I know my answer now, that we can promote going from the steps of awareness to concern to action a little more swiftly or a little more indicative of action?
Well, I'm thinking of an example in my own board service, which I probably can't tell you because we're videotaping it. But I think what you said goes to candor level and trust and safety among the board. So the example, I can't tell you what it is, but we had a presentation from, a regular presenter at the board, and they said, we want to do this. And it was so minor that, it was just a small issue, but a couple of us went berserk, and we said, you can't do that. We think this is terrible. And the guy who's making the presentation, it's like his face fell. He's like, what are you talking about? This is so minor. And we decided we couldn't take the time at the boardroom, so one of the ringleaders, I said, okay, we're going to take this offline. So we went offline, got the general counsel in, got a couple other people, and he said, this is so minor, but you can't do it. And so the way we engineered a face-saving response was we agreed to take this agenda item off the table, and we gave a big hint back to the guy who made the presentation that maybe he just ought to forget about it, because we didn't want to get into a big discussion where we would convince our other colleagues to all vote against him on this very small matter. But I think you hit it on the head, because recognizing what's a no big deal is difficult. And the problem is that your fellow board members may see it as a no big deal, and you're the itch. You're the voice that wants to keep pursuing it. So I think having a familiarity and a trust level with your fellow board members, and also figuring out, okay, I'm not going to take 45 minutes at a board meeting to pursue what I know looks to all my colleagues like a no big deal, but I'm going to figure out a process, I come back to my word process, of how to address it and maybe figure out what to do about it.
Can I just
Go
add
ahead,
one thing?
disagree.
No, I'm not. I'm not. I think it's just a beautiful example. Just one thing to think about is that, and it has very much to do with what Donna and Dawn Marie were talking about, is that candor is actually how organizations become successful. If I had to name one thing that you have to create, it's disagreement, professional disagreement in your culture. And as a CEO, you have to actually force it to happen over and over again. And when you create that culture is when you can still have trust, and you will hear about things sooner. But I would also say that part of the elegance that you need to develop as a young person particularly, because your understanding of truth inside big organizations may be limited, more limited than even you think it is you actually have to start giving voice to your values. So on the first topic, Patrick Lencioni wrote The Advantage. You should read it. It's about, if you go into a meeting, everybody criticizes meetings. Meetings are actually the penultimate example of a culture. How they are run, whether there's disagreement. If there isn't, it's a bad culture, back to Leon's point, or maybe Frank's, that you gotta have the cultural assessments being done, right? If they don't invite that candor and that critique, you've got a bad culture. Your company, your firm will not do as well. But as a young person particularly, and I think it applies to all ages, read Mary Gentile's book on giving voice to values. All you have to do is read the appendix. It's a beautiful book, and it tells you how to be sophisticated in addressing people with your concerns on moral issues or ethical issues. Is you don't, and it's actually very consistent with Jonathan Haidt's work on Righteous Minds, you don't actually react right away. You give it the 2-minute wait. The parent's advice on 10 seconds. Give it a 2-minute wait, decide, is it worth doing in a public setting, worth doing privately, worth doing through with a group of other people? Don't not voice your values, but do it really intelligently and sophisticated. We owe anybody we think is making an unethical decision, we owe them the right to explain to us a truth that we may not understand. Secondly, We owe them the right to be able to reverse it. Thirdly, we're no worse off. Because even if they don't reverse it and they still didn't give us a better sense of truth, you can still have the same reaction you had. We're going to have anyway, which is either I won't do it or I quit.
Can I put a PS to that? That's lovely. I want to put a PS to that, Jean-Pierre, and that is that it's an argument that, going back to Paula's question to us, it's an argument for diversity. Because somebody's going to have some discomfort.
Yeah. Is it on this point? Yes. Yeah, please follow up, and then we'll return to Michael. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Exactly on this point, I wanted to note what we call the diversity premium, which is you get a better return on investment as an organization, as a business, if you have a diverse leadership group. This has been documented. But that gives you the other side of the coin from the diversity premium is the diversity challenge. Because when you have diverse voices at the table, you have different perspectives, and you need to be able to deal with the conflict that emerges when you have diverse voices at the table. The only way to take advantage of the diversity premium is to have a context of safety and trust where people can speak up. And in regard to this, it's been noted that it's not enough, Dawn, Marie, to have one woman on a board.
Oh, sure.
That one person of color or one person of diversity on a board, you need to have at least 3. Because speaking up, voicing values is very difficult. And if you're the lone voice that's always expressing the need to think critically, you're not going to change the culture. You're not going to have input into the values. You need at least 3 voices to support each other in speaking up.
I have 3 on the board that I'm on, and what we do is we know certain male board members that are in sync with us. So if we want to raise something, we plant it with them.
Isn't that sad you have to do that even?
No, it makes
But
sense.
that's smart.
No, that's exactly what we teach, and it's called Men as Allies. Developing your allies, developing your alliance, so that you can. And this is about culture, changing culture to have purpose as your underlying motivation, purpose and mission as your underlying motivation, and then creating a context where people can support each other in speaking out, and the culture will change. The culture will evolve to embody what people really want, which is to enable them to be a part of something that's greater than themselves, that has real purpose and real mission.
It seems like there's a follow-up to the follow-up.
There is. Christine Adamo, and sister following you up, a graduate of Simmons. Okay, so I want to propose, and I'd love to have everybody's reaction to this. Operationalizing what you've just very elegantly expressed and summarizing what all of you have expressed, could we consider an impact index that could be defined either at the board level or the executive leadership level or at the shareholder level that would get away from looking at diversity on boards, which I resent, looking at the sole responsibility being the executive leadership, which we're not trained at. The 50, 60, 70-year-old executives aren't there. The young guys are being trained in college, but it's going to be 20 to 30 years before they get there. But could we look at defining an impact index and then figuring out a way to institutionalize it through a standard? How would that look? Who would institutionalize it? Would it be acceptable, and at what level of shareholder? Executive leaders, shareholders, employees, who would use and or adopt that? because your beautiful illustration of virtue, and again, I resent that. I'm Catholic. I don't want to bring my Catholic virtues to the workplace because I've been fired 4 times for doing that in my career in corporate America. And I've been to litigation 4 times. And they've all settled out of court because they're public companies and they don't want a scandal. And I'm of that age where it would have been a scandal. Okay, so how do we neutralize the emotion around the terminology and yet get cred in the shareholder evaluation process? Please.
Go ahead, Don.
Tough one.
Fidel, yeah, you do.
It's a really tough one, eh? I don't know. I mean, it's a complicated question. We go through periodic evaluation of board members and the board itself, so individuals and also as a group. Maybe it's the right place to try to find that index. I don't know. Try to evaluate properly if we are conscious about diversity, if we are really considering it. Maybe is that the right place? We have an evaluation committee from the board, and maybe it should be included in that evaluation, both individually and as a group. I don't know. Just some thoughts.
Yeah. I'm wondering, sorry, what's your name again? Christine. So Christine, impact of what?
That's what I'm asking. You talk about dignity.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, but what is dignity and how does that impact my bottom line?
Okay, so
What is virtue? How does that impact performance?
I was sharing
Describe
with you
it.
during the break that we have several, well, Erica is a part of this organization called and so are you, Manuel, the Humanistic Management Network. And what this Humanistic Management Network is, a group of business ethicists from all over the world got together after 2008, 2009, after the collapse, and said, you know what, we can do better than this. We can do better. And what they decided was, instead of the old traditional paradigm of focusing on shareholder profit as the objective of the company, the idea was that we're going to focus on human dignity as the sole concern of this business paradigm. Erica, help me if I'm getting this wrong. Thank you. And so the whole idea, it's a complete shift in mindset about what the function of business is, and Mike understood this profoundly. Why are we doing business? And, the whole focus is to do business to try to create a better world, not just profits for a certain small group of people. And so, I don't know, it's a worldwide network now, Erica, right? And so if you get people to really sign on to, okay, human dignity is what we're going to focus on here. And you know what the initial findings of the research that it's coming out of this new paradigm shift is that employee engagement increases when people have companies where this human dignity is the core and the center of the concern. Productivity increases, employee engagement, loyalty, turnover, employee turnover, because people want to work at a place when they feel valued, they feel seen, and all of this, they feel appreciated. The other thing, and I'll say this last, but the findings are that profits also increase. So if I'm understanding your question, and I'm not sure I do, but I think the impact of treating people well, as if everybody matters, would be that impact index for me, personally. And to what does that look like all the way down the supply chain? Not just how you, as a board, treat the company, but because you know what? The company itself has dignity. It's an entity into itself, and this is what we want to preserve in this mindset, this new business paradigm. How do we create those cultures? And I think the Humanistic Management Network is doing a profound job at trying to articulate that. They're doing the research, and so.
Yeah, I agree.
Manuel,
yeah, sorry. I was going to say, I didn't know you wanted to talk. But it's true. The company has dignity, and I believe that's what you're working on, right? The study you are doing right now.
So yeah, following up I was not going to ask, and there's here a young guy who's going to also ask, but what we are trying to do, and we have Erica and Sandra and more people involved in humanistic management movement, is that I think your question is great, but it's too early still to answer that question. That's why it's so complicated. We need to build a language. We still have so many things we are starting to discuss here today that no one is discussing, or everyone knows, everyone has the intuition of the importance of this, but in management, we don't have the language. So like your work in virtue is so impressive. My question was going to be at the end, how do you practice that even in families? I would love to use that with children in family.
Sure.
Like 132 virtues and then pick up 5, and we will try to practice this week at home. I think that's a great model. We should just, but for that, you need first to have good examples, and you're producing the good examples and the language, and then we need to write books, and then is when you can get an index. But we don't even have the language for that index to be produced. That's my concern. So I'm even putting your question kind of much more difficult now. We need that effort, and I think the humanistic management movement is trying to do that. We have and I'm going to say this because next month we will have a workshop here. Donna will be one of the people running this. It's 3 days. It's just for practitioners, and what we want to do is basically very simple. Bring here a person like Donna saying, what is human dignity, like the language? Let's try to understand what it is, and then having like no more than 20 practitioners asking them, what are you doing to practice this? Mm-hmm. What are you trying to do? Even probably you didn't even know about the name or the concept of the language. What are you trying to do? And once we know what you're trying to do, your good practices, and there will be 20 guys, 20 people telling to the others what they're trying to do, which are your difficulties and barriers. And then what will you try to do in 1 year from now? Mm-hmm. And from there, we want to learn together, like 15, 20 managers together, working together, and we academics will be learning from them. It's just the opposite of what we try to normally. So, and we are trying to learn from practical wisdom the language, and then we will think about the index. You are too early in your question for my way of thinking, but humanistic management, I think this is the project. And I invite anyone knowing any good practitioner who is really trying to do that and want to learn from others and to create the language, they are invited to be part of this project. So, sorry, but I don't know. I think I was trying to answer to comment to your question. And my question was, by the way, and there is a guy here, but what about the children, young families, young kids? Because what you're saying, once they are 20, 25, it's so difficult to change habits and promote new virtues or to change minds or processes. And it's so difficult. It's all the entire process of changing that. What do we do with children? What can we get from all your learning from?
I have to say, it was interesting when we did this. Goldman Sachs was part of one of the customers we were doing it with, and they actually came back and they said, "We see this, effort going on, a practice going on in your centers. We built child care centers for Goldman Sachs. They said, we like this to be done in the home, and so that was just like a wake-up call. I said, wow, that's an interesting topic. So we actually put together practice sessions on how you live order with a 6-year-old. Picking up your socks, putting them in the drawers, all of those sorts of things, and worked up this whole way of doing it within the family, and that proved to be one of the most effective parts of the whole program.
Well, I'm doing a lot of dignity work in schools. I've got several private schools all over the country who have decided they wanted to try to create a dignity curriculum and understand this from a very young age. And so the teachers, it's remarkable. They tell me that these young kids know this dignity stuff from very deep inside them. They know what it feels like to be mistreated. They know what it's like when their teacher does honor their dignity, and they know what it's like to be bullied, all of these things. And so this is something we have to leverage, Manuel, just that you're asking this question is so important. Because imagine, we were saying just earlier that the guys or women are being the millennials are being trained now, but it's going to take 20 years before they get into these positions of power. But we have to start young, really, really young. And I have really happy to report that in my book, Leading with Dignity, my publisher says, Donnie, you have to be shameless about promoting this. Want to hold it up, Christine? She's got the book. Leading with Dignity, How to Create a Culture That Brings Out the, yay! How to create a culture that brings out the best in people. There's a whole, chapter 5 is all about the educational programs that are being conducted all over the country. So, kindergarten. Yep, kindergarten.
Yeah, I don't know if you meant, and I'm sorry if you were just ready. I don't know if you meant young children, which we failed miserably at. I hope our example did what it needed to, but we didn't consciously speak about these things with my children. Now they're way beyond old, but like I am. But high school was always a really interesting age for me to be thinking about exposing them to the terms of kindness and niceness and how those differ, and that they really do differ. And one of the mental attitudes that you can have in life that I think speaks to this issue of dignity is just mentally realize that you're a kind person when you deliver uncomfortable messages to people who need them, including your friends, including people you work with. It's a lifelong pursuit to make that distinction. One is actually about you and avoiding conflict, that's niceness. Kindness is actually engaging in conflict for the benefit of others. It's actually outward looking. And I actually think that's an important mental mindset. And we talk in work for adults. One of my mantras has always been, you don't have to like somebody, you just have to respect them.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, you won't like everybody, but you got to respect them.
Got to treat them with dignity.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to add, sorry, that, sorry, please excuse me, eh?
Yeah.
When we launched our corporate social responsibility recently, and Manuel came to our company to make a nice presentation, I got some inquiries from employees saying, hey, we should do this at schools. Because no one talks about this at high school. Mm-hmm. And it's true. Mm-hmm. It's true. Virtues, as you said, is by practicing. And I used to get mad with my kids, when they're not picking up their clothes or whatever. Not anymore. You have to do it every day, one day after the other. And that's the way to do it. Mm-hmm. And we should think about this at schools because people was interested, really. And I think it's very important.
Hello, my name is Michael Ochoa. I work with Dr. Petranovich at the Abigail Adams Institute.
Ah.
And it sounds like you, Donna, and you, Fidel, are interested in promoting empathy and dignity at a grassroots level, working with children. And my question is concerning the should of this. So it sounds like none of you disagree that dignity can be the moral foundation for a paradigm of business, an ethical code within business, that there's an a priori responsibility to dignity. And you said earlier, Donna, that some executives do not, if you ask them whether they believe that every person has the same amount of dignity, and you made the points that there is the paradise, something where the higher you are within a business, the less likely you are to empathize with people at a lower level. So I'm wondering if you think it is your responsibility, the should question, to convince other businesses that they should take up the a priori moral responsibility of putting dignity at the roots of their business. And to Leo's point, I'm wondering if this could be done not necessarily through a top-down, but a bottom-up, through convincing the consumer that they should look after their own dignity and go about navigating the world of business in such a way. And the other part to this question is has to do with virtue signaling. And you can look virtuous and not be virtuous. You can even complete a virtuous action and not be virtuous, where if I were to pick up a water ball on the street litter, for someone to see me picking it up, I don't believe that would be virtuous of me to do, because my intention is to look virtuous, not to actually clear the road of litter. And you made the point that when we put dignity at the core of the business patagram, it actually increases profits. So if I was one of the executives who did not empathize, I would look at that as data, and I would say, well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to put dignity at the bottom, but not because I believe in it, not because it's more roots, but because it's going to create more profits. And I'm wondering if that's a problem.
Well, I mean, people in and by the way, Sandra is also a significant player in the humanistic, Sandra Waddick right there. She's also, but I think that's the reason why, like Michael Pearson doesn't even like to mention those data that it increases profits, because he wants us to understand that this is the right thing to do, to treat people as if they have value and worth. So on that point, I think, that's why I said profit was the last thing. I'd like to increase the awareness of loyalty and employee engagement and productivity and all of that first. but going in and telling other companies that they need to look at dignity, and what you asked that question, is that what part of the mission? The responsibility, yeah. The thing about responsibility, I'm really glad you brought it up, because that was also another issue I was going to raise. Because, with dignity, it's not just that we have to claim our dignity and to behave in dignified ways, but we're also responsible for dignity. And not just our own dignity. We're responsible for every dignity in all of its manifestations. So we're responsible to safeguard the dignity of each other, and as I mentioned earlier, something greater than ourselves. And that's the mission, I think, and the purpose that Fidel was talking about. When you can convince a company, and I don't do the convincing part. I don't go into a company unless they want it. So I'm not there to push. I'm there to deliver some goods. And so when you can get people to see, whether it's that guy who is not really is suspicious of this and only needs to see the evidence and the data, if you can get an entire workforce to recognize not only what's in it for them, but also how they can make a contribution and how they can hold themselves responsible for something greater than themselves. What's your name again? Michael. And Michael, the thing is, there is something that people seem to be yearning for in that. There's this meaning, this purpose bigger than themselves, even though their own dignity is already taken care of, by the company, but they want to give back. They want to pay it forward. And this I see in my millennial students, just writ large. So there's something that it's satisfying, and I think it's a spiritual dimension, actually. It's satisfying this connection that we all have to something greater than ourselves. And how can we make a contribution to that? So dignity and responsibility, in my mind, are two sides of the same coin. And that's when you really grasp dignity consciousness. You recognize that what you give is equally as important as what you get from dignity.
We were having this audit committee recently, internal audit committee, and we were discussing about opening the, let's say, compliance channel, for denuncias. I don't know, compliance, yeah, to customers and suppliers also. And we automatically would say, yes, of course, we should publish it at the website because it's according to our code of conduct. And I would have appreciated in the past that maybe some other companies would have done this, because I would have sent some emails to certain companies. It's a way of also raising awareness and dignity to customers and suppliers, putting them all together.
Thank you very much. My name is Alejandro Cañadas. I teach economics and finance, and also I'm a fellow at the IECO. So I want to go back to Christine's question and to the comment that Manolo has made. And actually, when we listen to all of you, actually there are a lot of real impact of being ethical, right, in different areas, looking at the dignity of the human person, right? And I'm going, because I teach human ethics and also finance, something very interesting happened last year. The CEO of BlackRock, the most important, biggest, largest investment firm in the world, he sent a letter to all the clients and to all the community, and he said in the letter two things, main 2 points. One is every organization is doing something great for the society. And we have to first know what is the good thing that we do first. Second, communicate, which is a lot of things that you have said. And the second point is we should be able to measure the impact of our goodness in society as a company. So I was, with that idea and these comments, I think that we have a great opportunity as we are developing and learning from you and practitioners that we are not measuring these things well. We don't know, maybe it's not something, but in some ways, right, Bill, you talk about you have the impact. We have done this, and I have that impact in my company. 80% increase or reduction in cost, all these amazing things, right? So as maybe in the IECO, in our research, we have this great opportunity to fill the gap of not measuring things, right? Because maybe we don't know how to do it, but I think with the data that we have, which is your examples, right, we have an opportunity to fill that gap. My question to you is, do you think that that is something that can help us not only to teach young people, right, especially at the university? Negative cases are great, but also telling them that when they do these ethical things, actually there are positive impacts, right? Because we already know this individually, but we don't promote this, right? And maybe we can create a way to measure this better, right?
Well, I think one example is, the attention now to ESG factors, in which John and I are going to give a presentation at Bentley. And
What's ESG?
Environmental, social, and governance.
Okay.
And it used to be maybe a standalone concept, but now some investment managers like Wellington are doing this in an integrated fashion, and they're not even labeling a company or a fund as ESG, because it sometimes has a negative connotation to some people, that you're sacrificing returns to do good. But if you look at the recent studies, and there's a big meta-study, 2015, I think University of Hamburg did, that showed there's a direct relationship between analyze a company's material ESG factors with financial performance. And I think as this gains momentum, more so in Europe than here, but with UNPRI, everybody's catching up to it. I think it'll be in the right direction.
Yeah, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on that. One of the things that we are leading at SHIFT on behalf of the British government and a number of other large entities is a means of evaluating the S in ESG. And so this is ultimately designed to allow us to provide some meaningful content for investors, because right now it's garbage in, lots of garbage out. The place that we've started, and there's a study that I wrote on as part of our Valuing Respect project, is trying to identify what kind of culture is important, is special, and maybe unique for respecting human rights under the guiding principles. And a lot of it is resonant with what you've been talking today. But our goal is really to develop tools to enable investors to evaluate companies on their E, environmental, S, social impact, and G, governance. And it's incredibly relevant to what we're talking about. And I'll say, Manuel, in response to what you said and what you're saying, we can't wait. You can't wait to develop these metrics because people are suffering.
Yes.
What do you do in the meantime? This can't be just an academic process. It has to be plugged into real time. It has to be made real to investors. So I'm very interested in humanistic management, and I want to see how it can help us evaluate the S and how investors can.
Thank you. Speaking of time pressure, there's about 10 minutes left, so we'll take 3 questions, and that's it. Maybe should we take them all at once and then leave it up to our panelists to take up any responses? Yeah. Well, let's see how it goes. Okay.
So I feel like a little bit of a throwback, because my comment is not about evaluation so much as it's about leadership. But it relates to the whole picture. And one of the things that I think we need to think about is what a new leadership paradigm looks like in a culture of dignity and moral and social responsibility. And I just want to put out a couple of points. And what I've heard today is, and what I teach about leadership, is that we need to think about leadership and look at the balance between being assertive and being empathetic. We need to think about the balance between being powerful and being an agent of empowerment as a leader. And we need to think about competition versus collaboration. So I think there's a new leadership paradigm that's beckoning us that will fit into this culture that we're trying to create.
Yes, Leon.
So a couple of points, because everything is just mind-blowing. I'm sure there's much left in my mind. In terms of my earlier question about training shareholders, actually, I think you can, because you just talked about it. It's humanistic management. In doing that, we're slowly going to train our shareholders as well. The other is we need to keep in mind, I would urge everyone, this is a journey. There will never be an end. It's a long and painful journey, and it keeps growing and growing. Most of the studies and measurements that, if you take a lesson from the compliance world, what's easy to measure is probably not what you really want. And what you can measure is probably going to come as meta-studies. Because for the most part, you're really trying to measure something that never happened. If your program is working well and you prevented harm, it's very hard to measure that you prevented harm. It's hard to show I prevented a loss of X dollars because it never happened. It's not in your books. You just kept going. So I think you have to be prepared for the long journey and understand that trying to measure it is going to be an ongoing trial and error. And the last is we need to go back and remember history. We have been there before, and it's all happened before. I would urge everyone to look at the 1944 Johnson & Johnson credo about how that business will be run. And if you look at it, the first paragraph says our primary responsibility are the parents and children we serve. Our second responsibility, and all we should care about, are the physicians and nurses. Next, our employees, our scientists, and everyone who works here. Then the government. And the last paragraph says, if we did the above pretty well, we'll make a fair return on our money. And that's, I think, the example of you need to look at all those first and be a social good is what it's about.
And on that note, I think this is the last question, so I will first make a comment and finish what I started and I finished, and I just realized the workshop we are planning to have, Donna will be the first day, and that will be about human dignity, but it's 3 days kind of workshop. And it's this idea of a journey, I totally agree. It's like the education of children. It's a journey. It takes the entire life. And then you're trying to educate in virtues that it takes years. And then we are all free human beings, and it's a process that is alive. So we need to measure. In a car, you measure things, and now in the modern car, you're measuring many more things because of the complexity of the car. You always measure, and we had to figure out which one is the right measure you want. But I wouldn't focus so much on the measure, but on the purpose, on the where do you want to go. And in that sense, the workshop will be first day, like the input. The starting point is human dignity. The process is human work, well done. So we will focus on optimal work project here by a professor at Harvard, which is basically promoting virtues in a work well done, where you don't have anxiety, you just focus and you get a lot of virtues. And from there, you get the habit and you bring the habit back home. And it's unity of life. And so it's the input, the process, and the output is human flourishing, which are the three where human well-being, human flourishing. We had this discussion in the humanistic manner, it's just language, but it's human flourishing. It's about the contribution, the greater good, and you becoming a great person because you're giving your best to others. It's not just you're becoming because you want to be the best. It's you're giving your best to others. And that's human flourishing. So these are the 3 steps. We'll get some measures. We will use them, but we will get people learning in the process. So this is a journey, and it's a learning lab. Every year we will have the same companies coming and different managers from the same companies to learn and tell the others in the company and see how, and then we will tell the story to others to make sure that this works. I mean, we will do this in a month, and we will want to practice that next day. That said, my question, final question is, sorry. Sorry. My final question is about Michael Hoffman. This is all about Michael Hoffman today. So I learned so much from him about leadership, about trust, about everything, how to do things. So I wanted to ask each one of you, what can we, all of us, each one of us, what would you suggest? One simple idea, practical idea, what would you suggest that we can do to imitate what Mike did? To just try to do our best for the academic world, the practitioners. How can we imitate Mike? What would you suggest after today's conversation?
Can I? Because it's mind-blowing, as the gentleman was saying, and it's so intense. My recommendation would be just to allocate time, okay? Because we step out of here, and then probably we don't talk about this or think about this until the next chance. And we should force ourselves to allocate time to talk about this, or just to reflect about all what we've discussed today. That would be my call.
I knew him just a little bit, but certainly the takeaway I had was how beautifully he led the human virtues of respect, of knowledge, of kindness, and humility. And that was obvious in just a few meetings that I had with him, and it really was pivotal at a time when I was thinking, is this something I really want to spend more time doing? And he certainly helped me make that decision.
Well, I want to come at this from the framing of the journey, and then I'll circle back to Mike in a minute. But, you know, I woke up in the middle of the night several months ago, and I had this insight that there's something beyond dignity. And it startled me. It startled me. So what is it? What, you know, because here I thought, you know, I've exhausted this concept and I'm out there trying to promote it and everything. And then what I realized was, and part of the journey, Leon, is that what would it look like if we had a world where everybody were treating each other with dignity? What would that look like? And you're talking about human flourishing, and that we'd all be doing well. Well, I think there's even a higher balcony to get on and look and to answer that question. Because I think the higher balcony is that with this concept that we're trying to develop, whether it's in humanistic management or in our everyday lives, I think what we're doing is we're pushing the evolution of our consciousness. We are pushing the boundaries of human evolution. It's big. And in fact, it's so big, I can't even see the edges of it now. So we are moving our species toward a better place. I think we're moving our species toward a better place. I think it's that deep. And if we can all be agents of that change, those of us in the business community, in the religious community, in the educational community, you know, on boards and all of the, in classrooms and all of that, we are pushing the boundaries of what it means to be human. And I just get terribly excited about that. And I think Mike would have been on the bandwagon. So that's what I would say.
Time to call your agent.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like what you just said, because I do think Mike was definitely an agent in a field that he developed. And Tuesday, at Mike's party, I'm calling it Mike's party, I spoke about 6 adjectives, so I'll just pick out one to say what I think we could do. Mike was very accessible. And, you know, I said, your second cousin's first babysitter wants to go meet him, and Mike would say, you know, yeah, have him come in. And everybody, one way or another, kind of also told the story of how wonderful he was. I mean, you said, you know, you just come out and talk, and you said you just showed up and look what happened. And so I would focus on the word accessible, because I think one reason that Mike was such an agent of the change that you're thinking about was he was so accessible to everybody in just a loving way that was wonderful. So when I think about Mike, I'm going to try to be a little better in that scope myself.
That's nice.
That's great. I don't have any brilliance. I just think one of the things we've touched on here is that people need to make a spiritual mission out of their work, their careers, their professions. When they do that without any particular religion attached, not making it a conversion exercise, but actually are authentically owning a spiritual mission in life, they can communicate in ways that invite all of these topics to come in. They can be vulnerable, they can talk about empathy, they can talk about social skills, virtue, et cetera. And there's a term Chakraborty uses in the Hindu scripture translation he does for business, which is spironomics. I just want to mention one last thing on a lighter note. it's a damn good thing Milton Friedman went to University of Chicago and taught, because when he came here at my graduation to get an honorary degree at Harvard, the law school all stood up and turned around when he was introduced. But it was because of Chile. They didn't know they should have been doing it because of his shareholder primacy.
Good, very good. Well, I've worked up an appetite just listening to you guys and the interchange and the exchanges, which were absolutely wonderful. Thank you again, RCC. Thank you, IECO. It's really been a pleasure, and thank you, our panelists. The conversation continues next door. See you next year.
Thank you all.